Hello Chipmunk and Chipette fans, my name is Grandy Tamias, and welcome back to another installment of Alvin and the Chipmunks Elaborations. Today's topic will be, what would have happened if there had been sequels to the Chipmunk Adventure? First, I want to preference this elaboration by saying that it is downright impossible, or at least immensely improbable, that sequels to the Chipmunk Adventure could be made in this day and age. Not only is there not a high public demand for them, and that Bagdasarian Productions does not typically go back and add new material to prior versions of this franchise, but the style of animation used for the original film is largely outdated. So I'm mainly going to be focusing my points on what would have theoretically been possible within the first couple of years after the Chipmunk Adventure was released. Or at least during the era when the 80s Chipmunks were still active, like with the TV specials in the mid-90s and the time they were under Universal. Speaking of which, I don't consider Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein and Meet the Wolfman to be sequels to the Chipmunk Adventure, but that's just my personal opinion anyway. I mean, can you really call Meet Frankenstein the Chipmunk Adventure 2 when there's not much adventure going on and the plot revolves around Frankenstein's monster, which has nothing to do with anything that was core to the identity of the original film? As far as whether or not it would have been feasible to make Chipmunk Adventure sequels back in the day, there are several things we'd have to take into account. First is money. While the film's budget has never been confirmed, the box office total of the Chipmunk Adventure was less than $7 million, and was considered a financial loss. Therefore, there was no profit that could have gone towards funding the production of more films, or even improvements to the TV show. Speaking of which, because of the film's production and/or its financial failure, the later seasons of the TV show had to switch to a different animation company. Whereas the first 5 seasons were animated by Ruby Spears Productions, seasons 6 through 8 were done mostly by Deke Entertainment, with a few season 6 episodes done by Murakami Wolf Swenson. So it just wouldn't make sense to fund a sequel after the first Chipmunk Adventure bombed, and even if it hadn't, the franchise at the time may have had to cancel the TV show entirely if they wanted to reallocate enough resources towards more films. Secondly, the Chipmunk Adventure is infamous for its production troubles, and I doubt many of the same animators who worked with Ross Bagdasarian Jr. and Janice Carmen before would have been willing to do so again. And it wasn't pleasant for them either, as it was Janice's first time directing. In fact, she's the first female director of an animated film, while she was pregnant and building a home out of town, on top of the TV series as well. Third, it did not seem like Ross and Janice were all that confident in the film, as in the Saturday Morning Cartoon Rewind interview from last year, Janice talked about the film's production. And I'm not sure if I'm allowed to play the audio from it, so I'll just link it in the description. But to summarize, Janice talked about how she and Ross didn't know what the final edit of the film looked like, so they went into the film's premiere snowblind, only saw it that one time, and didn't watch it again for 20 years until it was on TV, at which point they finally relaxed and realized that they liked the end result. And I can relate. There are a couple of my own videos that I haven't rewatched in a couple years, either because they weren't as detailed and comprehensive as some of my newer videos, or I wasn't proud of the audio quality. But I've gone back and rewatched a few and I realize, yeah, they have some flaws, but they still have a good amount of value to them. Getting back to the Chipmunk Adventure though, if Ross and Janice had only seen the film once for the first 20 years of its existence, what makes you think that they would have wanted to make a sequel to it at any point during that time, let alone during the era of the TV series? Besides, even if the Chipmunk Adventure had turned a profit and the Bagdasarians were confident and wanted to continue that story, sequels to animated films were a rarity in Hollywood at that time, and even then, a lot of them were direct-to-video. Speaking of direct-to-video, now some of you might be wondering, why couldn't the 2 Universal films have been the Chipmunk Adventure 2 and 3 instead of the monster stuff we got? Well, I don't know if Ross and Janice's agreement to allow Alvin and the Chipmunks to be co-owned by Universal meant their hands were tied with certain creative decisions, but I think Universal might have wanted to use those films to promote their classic movie monsters. After all, they didn't seem to care much for the Chipmunk IP, which led to that big lawsuit. I'm not going to deny that we got some good films out of it, but Universal likely did not have the Bagdasarians' best interests in mind. Plus, by the late 90s, the Chipmunk Adventure had not yet built up a big enough cult following that Universal would have wanted to revisit that, even if Bagdasarian had. But as a thought experiment, let's just say that the Chipmunk Adventure had at the very least broken even, Bagdasarian was confident enough, had animators who were willing to work for them, and a studio willing to distribute. Regardless of it being theatrical or direct-to-video, I'm uncertain of what kind of story they could have done. The characters already went around the world, so I don't know how they could top that unless they go to space. And we all know why that's a bad idea. Then again, they didn't spend too long at most of the locations, and they visited similar ones in later seasons of the show, so in that sense, there are still a lot of locations they didn't visit, or at least we didn't see them visit, and they could spend more time in one or a few of them, which would make those places feel more fleshed out. For example, maybe the Chipmunks and Chipettes could get lost in a major city like San Francisco or New York. Or if they're out in the wilderness, maybe they could go to some natural wonder like the Grand Canyon. Maybe they could recycle unused concepts from the first movie, like when they got captured in Soviet Russia. I'd exclude trips to small tropical islands, though, not because of Chipwrecked, but because of the episode that inspired Chipwrecked, Island Fever. I think it would have been weird to have a deserted island story twice in the 80s era. Maybe they could explore a cave for one scene, or somewhere else underground. Okay, coming off script here, I was going to say that I wouldn't want them to find some underground world, but then I remembered the first film took inspiration from Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, and he also published other adventure novels like Journey to the Center of the Earth. So if they wanted to keep up the adventure, like Jules Verne inspiration as a trend from the first movie, they could do that, but honestly, that would have been better suited for the cartoon, since the Chipmunk Adventure was a bit more realistic and not as fantastical. Maybe the Chipmunk Adventure 2 or 3 could have been a Christmas movie, maybe where they go to the North Pole, kind of like they eventually did in the CGI series Christmas special. I mean, it would make sense because this franchise is associated a lot with Christmas. As for the villains or some other antagonistic force, I mentioned how Claudia and Klaus Verstein from the first film were some of, if not the best villains in the entire franchise. However, I don't feel like they should be brought back because I felt like their story was perfectly wrapped up, and I don't think they'd have much to offer in a new setting with a different scenario. Unless the filmmakers wanted to continue the story of the first one and have Claudia and Klaus as a nice continuity bridge for that. But we all know this franchise typically sticks to standalone stories, so they'd probably make up new villains for Chipmunk Adventure 2 and 3. To conclude, while the Chipmunk Adventure lacks any potential for a sequel now or back in the 80s and 90s, it's at least fun to think about with hindsight where the story could have gone and what effect this would have had on the whole franchise. Personally, I'm happy with just the one film we got, and going any further with animated films at the time could have distanced the franchise away from the TV side of things. But feel free to let me know in the comments, should there have been sequels to the Chipmunk Adventure, and if it were possible, what do you think they should be about? And if you have any suggestions for future topics in my Alvin and the Chipmunks Elaborations series, leave those in the comments as well. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.